Two very brief steps before we can move outside. We need to introduce two other important people at this event. I'd like to invite to come up and join us the co-director of the conference, Felix Dodds. Felix is a fellow of the Global Research Institute here at UNC and an associate fellow of the Tellus Institute. And I will leave it to Felix to introduce Albert Butare, the former Minister of Energy and Water for the Republic of Rwanda, who was the co-chair of the 2011 Bonn Nexus conference. Felix, come on up.
Thank you, Jamie. I can't resist, of course, on commenting on a couple of the things that were said. But it is very much important to realize that the SDG agenda came from developing countries. It came from Colombia and from Guatemala, supported by UEA and by other countries. And I think it's also important to realize that no one is saying the MDG agenda doesn't have to be delivered. It has to be delivered. It's an integral part of the forward-looking SDG agenda. I would also say that though Planet Under Pressure, I had the pleasure of sitting on the steering committee for the conference, may not have shaken the outcome document, it definitely was part of the landscape that helped support some of the issues such as the Sustainable Development Goals process. And I would have to say, having been involved in this process for the last 20 years, that it was actually the scientists who got their act together earlier than anyone else, and it was the scientists who, at least in the preparatory process in 2011, had their views in front of governments ahead of the NGOs and many of the other sectors or stakeholders. So Planet Under Pressure happened very late in the process, but the science community was actually working 18 months earlier. On the declaration which you've heard about today, though it's a long declaration, I think it's 14 pages, the important bit is actually the 5 pages that's in italics in the middle of it. So if you are looking to influence the process of what will be a co-director's statement that will come out later, it's that core italic section is what we will eventually present. But the declaration itself has already been presented in the General Assembly of the UN on the 19th of February in the thematic debate on energy and water. So we're already engaged in getting our ideas in front of governments, and some of those will be here over the next few days to take the ideas and thoughts that are reflected on the panels and the workshops forward. It's a pleasure to be here with Albert. I had the opportunity of serving on the International Steering Committee for the Bonn Conference in 2011 under the great leadership of himself and his co-chair, Uschi Eid. I think the Germans took a very, very difficult issue, and after 20 years of very little integration and very little interlinkages, put down, I think, a really important building block, which is what we're building on here today. And I think that it's been a pleasure also for us to have Albert on our advisory group for the conference. He was the first person we asked to join. And I think the leadership that he's shown, not only in 2011, but since then, in taking forward the issue of the Nexus and helping to, I hope, develop some deep roots for it over the next few years is, I think, very important. He's also currently the Chief Executive Officer of the African Energy Services Group. As Jamie mentioned, he was the former Minister of Energy and Water in Rwanda. And before Albert speaks, I would just remind you all that we will have the first plenary session tomorrow at 8:30, and the person who was actually the inspiration behind the Sustainable Development Goals, Paola Cabrera, will be here to discuss and to put forward her viewpoints in light of what's just happened in New York in the last 3 days. And my final comment on that is that the SDG Open Working Group, or the co-chairs, have put interlinkages as one of the key areas that they will have in their work programme moving forward over the future. And so I think think Paolo's played a critical role in getting that agenda, and if we can support that in any small way, I think then this conference will have already succeeded. Tonight is about building a bridge from Bonn to Chapel Hill. Albert, maybe you can do the pleasure of taking us there.
Thank you very much, Felix. From Bonn Nexus to Chapel Hill via Rio. But what prompted Bonn to engage? So it's like the genesis of what made Bonn did what it did. I know academics, researchers like figures, so I try to capture some of the figures you might have seen many times. Nevertheless, I'll briefly go through them again to bring you the context. Although significant progress in improving people's standards of living has been made over time, still, secure climate change imperatives and the associated ingredients, including water, energy, and food supplies, remain far from being achieved globally. Basic services are not available to the bottom billion. We all know that about 1.1 billion are without adequate access to safe water, close to 1 billion are undernourished, and 1.5 billion are without access to modern forms of energy. People are thereby remaining deprived of their human rights and are trapped in poverty. And for many others beyond the bottom billion who have access to basic level of service, the system does not yet offer the resources needed to raise their livelihoods and emerge from poverty. With the 7% of global population of about 9.2 billion people living in cities by 2050, demands for water, energy, and food will increase exponentially. With the projections of about 70% increase in agricultural demand by 2050, energy demand increase of 40% by 2030, and water demand projections to satisfy agriculture and energy production in a similar order of magnitude. Ladies and gentlemen, threats prevail. Looking at this situation closely, growth of pressures on natural resources have grown to such an extent over the past 50 years that they are challenging the effectiveness of conventional planning and decision-making. Trying to meet demand through single-sector approaches in response to what are inherently interlinked and interdependent processes is limiting our ability to provide basic water, food, and energy services to poorest in the world, as well as failing to cope with the climate change that is continuously becoming unfaithful to us. Concurrently, there are signs of constrained growth, raised social and geopolitical tensions, and irreversible environmental change. Failing to recognize the consequences of one sector on another, weak governance systems, limited awareness, distortions from perverse subsidies, and lack of commitment can exacerbate a set of unintended consequences from decisions in one area onto the other. The result is suboptimal allocation of resources and inability to meet accepted norms of water, energy, and food. We are reaching, and in some cases have already exceeded the limit of resource availability, and therefore need to build on more innovative and sustainable solutions. Climate. Climate change is mostly driven by energy use and changes in land use. Climatic variability adds further pressures, for example, from accelerating drying of dry lands, reduced glacier water storage, more frequent and intense extreme events such as droughts or floods, and less reliable water supplies, as well as less reliable agricultural productivity. The food sector alone contributes about a third of total greenhouse gas emissions through energy use, land use change, methane emissions from livestock and rice cultivation, and nitrous oxide emissions from fertilized soils. At the same time, climate change mitigation places new demands on water and land resources, and also impacts on biodiversity. Climate adaptation measures such as intensified irrigation or additional water desalination are often energy intensive. Thus, climate policies can impact on water, energy, and food, and adaptation action can, in fact, be maladaptive if not well aligned in a nexus approach and implemented by appropriately interlinked institutions. While water, energy, and food have so far been mainly constrained by unequal access, humanity is now also approaching limits in global resource availability and sink strength, such as phosphorus supply or atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration. It is increasingly recognized that conventional supply-side management is coming to an end in many cases. Resource limitations in all sectors require a shift towards increased resource use efficiently, demand management, and more sustainable consumption patterns. Without such changes, current development trajectories threaten to drive socio-ecological systems at all scales towards critical thresholds. Crossing such thresholds could result in, for example, food crisis, basin closure, or crossing of planetary boundaries, which define a safe operating space for humanity. The newly emerging Sustainable Development Goals could provide an institutional foundation to address these boundaries, as well as equity issues associated with the allocation and distribution of limited resources. What I'm trying is to put all what was said by these other people here in some kind of political language or statement. Crossing critical thresholds as any scale could result in possibly reversible system changes, bringing negative impacts for ecosystems, socioeconomic development, and poverty alleviation. Such changes may also cause social unrest, conflicts, and migration. And so, ladies and gentlemen, the birth of Bonn Nexus initiative. That was the background. So the Bonn Conference attempted to present initial evidence on how a Nexus approach can enhance water, energy, and food security by increasing efficiency, reducing trade-offs, building synergies, and improving governance across sectors. Bonn Nexus came up with key messages. A Nexus perspective increases the understanding of the interdependencies across water, energy, and food, and other policies such as climate and biodiversity. Understanding the Nexus needed to develop policies, strategies, and investments to exploit synergies and mitigate trade-offs among these development goals, with active participation of and among government agencies, the private sector, academia, and civil society. It was thus found important to incorporate the Nexus perspective in the Rio+20, as well as in local, national, and other international planning activities focusing on either water, food, and energy, and climate. It offered the opportunities, it was mentioned. Applying a Nexus approach is an urgent must to identify the policy levers to implement a common future agenda and to create new opportunities for achieving these goals while reducing tensions between sectoral objectives. Realizing these opportunities require action for change in key fields. Very quickly, increase policy coherence by ensuring that synergies and trade-offs among water, energy, and food are identified both in the design and implementation of policies, plans, and investments. Accelerate access by progressively realizing in a more coordinated way the human rights obligation related to water, sanitation, energy, and food, and climate change to reap the resulting health, productivity, and development benefits. Create more with less by increasing resource productivity, establishing mechanisms to identify the optimal allocation of scarce resources for productive purposes. And waste and minimize losses by reducing waste and losses along supply chains to capture significant economic and environmental gains, and by changing mindsets and incentivizing technological development to run waste into a resource and manage it for multiple uses. Value natural infrastructure by investing to secure, improving, and restore the considerable multifunctional value of biodiversity in ecosystems to provide food and energy, conserve water, sustain livelihoods, and contribute to a green economy. And last but not least, mobilizing consumer influence by acknowledging and actively utilizing the catalyzing role that individuals have in choosing consumption patterns on such resources. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my belief that all of us here have the ability to contribute to some of these aspects, if not all. So, Bonn to Rio. The UN Conference on Sustainable Development, Rio+20, was meant to address two key themes among other important and relevant aspects: the green economy within the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication, and the institutional framework for sustainable development. As a specific contribution to Rio+20 process, the Bonn initiative intended to position the water, energy, and food security nexus in green economy concepts. The Bonn 2011, as commonly referred to, did provide a first platform for consideration of the close interlinkages of water, energy, and food security and the benefits of a nexus perspective in a multi-sector holder process. The specific message from Bonn Nexus to Rio was that the outcome of Rio+20 should adequately take into account and address the interdependencies between water, energy, and food, and act upon the challenge to make the nexus work for all of us, and especially the poor. The nexus approach is very much at the heart of the overall challenge of transforming our economies to green economies by changing growth patterns to become more sustainable. Making this happen is required to identify the forces that are driving the adoption of a nexus approach and to build alliances with them. This includes supporting leaders and champions at every level to take ownership and to develop the business case for integrated and sustainable solutions. Considering any change of approach is a particular challenge in today's economic climate, yet the consequences of inaction will progressively limit our ability to deliver on our commitments and result in increasingly severe consequences for people's welfare, economic growth, jobs, and the environment. The costs of inaction are too high, so we need to act. Rio to Chapel Hill. Coming from that part of the world that needs the nexus approach the most, right from Bonn through to Rio and after, my preoccupation has been on how fast this nexus philosophy should propagate and make an impact to the world in general and to the developing world in particular. When I got the invitation from my friend here, Felix Dodds, and learned that this gathering and discussion was to take place at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, I was exceptionally excited because of several reasons. But the most being that it is my belief that there is no better agents of change than academics and researchers, not only from their vast global networks that share common visions and goals, but also from the continuity nature of engagement to several generations. That is the difference. It is my trust, therefore, that researchers and scholars shall engage much beyond the scope of this dialogue today to ensure sustainable implementation of the nexus philosophy for better life of our peoples. And indeed, in response to the earmarked goals of this conference, let the UNC be the academic and knowledge hub, not the venue for the sustainable global outreach. We all know it is possible. Ladies and gentlemen, the declaration statement is comprehensive, in my view, and I do commend those who assembled it. My concern is, or is it my wish, to have another declaration now that tells us on how to implement and achieve the nexus tomorrow. Joachim said that we need to be patient, and unfortunately, I agree with him. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Albert, and I think we've now arrived at Chapel Hill, and we've also arrived at the point where you can go outside and have some drinks. So please enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you very much.